Okay. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. Today's workshop is part of a virtual series that we're putting on to substitute our IPAST program, which could not take place due to the pandemic. IPAST stands for Intensive Portuguese Abroad for Spanish teachers, and it's a 3-week program in Portuguese language and linguistics that we are hoping to offer in Curitiba, Brazil in July 2022. The program builds off of teachers' knowledge of Spanish and immerses them in Brazilian culture to increase their Portuguese proficiency. If you're interested, I'll go ahead and put the link to the IPAST website as well as our class webpage in the chat for you. So there's those links. And so far in this virtual sort of substitute of IPAST, we've which has been co-sponsored by Columbus State Community College. We have Raquel Pina here representing them. We've had a Portuguese pronunciation workshop with André Zampaulo and a pedagogy workshop with Michele Saraiva Carillo. I think I actually saw both of their faces today too. And today we'll have the third and final workshop in that series, which will be a contrastive look at Spanish and Portuguese grammar. And that will be presented by Dr. Scott Schwenter. Scott is probably a familiar face to many of you. He's both the director of the Center for Latin American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at Ohio State. Scott's a linguist who specializes in language variation and pragmatics in both Spanish and Portuguese, meaning that he analyzes how native speakers make choices based on characteristics of the grammatical system, something he'll talk about today quite a bit, as well as the discourse context. So Scott has published a tremendous amount on variable grammatical phenomena in both Spanish and in Portuguese, mainly Brazilian Portuguese, as well as comparative aspects of the two, which will be the focus of today's workshop, sort of comparing the grammar systems of those two languages. So one final note before we give the floor to Scott, please do put your questions in the chat as they come up. We'll save those for the end, and I'll sort of moderate and present those to Scott whenever he's finished. And then also, just as a reminder, if you're interested in receiving CEUs for today's session, we do require that you stay for the entire session, so just keep that in mind. All right, and with that, I'll yield the floor to Scott if you want to share your screen there.
Yes, thanks, Mark. A few of the things that Mark just said are things I was going to start with. But I will share my screen, and the idea today is I'm not going to try to condense my whole semester-long Portuguese grammar class into 2 hours, but I'm going to try to hit the highlights. And I do have more information available for those of you who would like more information. There are some familiar faces here, and I know there are people with lots of linguistic knowledge. And from what I saw from the sign-up sheet, there are also people with very little background. And so please ask questions in the chat when you don't understand something, or if I'm using some sort of terminology that you're not familiar with. One thing that I found out in doing these kinds of workshops, both presenting them and attending them, is that we're often not talking the same language. And I don't mean Spanish, English, or Portuguese. I mean technical language and terminology. So feel free to ask for clarification as we go along. And I haven't timed this out, so I don't know exactly how long it will take, but I will try to leave some time at the end to answer your questions to the extent that that is possible. If I don't know, I won't try to answer it, but maybe Mark will know, or someone else will know. Some other experts here in the audience. So let me share my screen. And so as Mark said, this is part of our virtual IPAST program. I'll just go over this quickly again. So what is IPAST? Let me just give you a little more background. Sorry about that. Than what Mark did. So my now retired colleague and former director of the Center for Latin American Studies, Professor Terrell Morgan, for over 30 years has had a program called SSAST. I don't know why that keeps showing up. Which is summer seminars abroad for Spanish teachers. That has been held in both Latin America and Spain. So IPAST, it only took 30 years, but are you guys seeing this window that keeps coming up on my screen? So I'm not sure why. Let me get out of this for just a second and see if I can figure out. Maybe that will do it. Okay. So let's go back. Okay. So it only took 30 years for us to come up with a Portuguese equivalent of SSAST. And to have some sort of parallelism with that acronym, we created IPAST, Intensive Portuguese Abroad for Spanish Teachers, on the assumption that Spanish teachers would also be interested in learning and teaching Portuguese. And also we've been working closely with the Ohio Department of Education, attempting to get Portuguese into the K through 12 classroom in Ohio. So unfortunately, the pandemic hit. As with so many other things, our first version of IPAST was slated for last summer. The second version was slated for this summer, and we haven't been able to do either of them. So we're doing this set of 3 workshops to sort of take the place. Though the biggest part of IPAST will be the intensive Portuguese part for the teachers that will be taught by native speakers in Brazil, in the city of Curitiba, which is in southern Brazil. And the idea was to do intensive Portuguese for 2 weeks. And then obviously you're housed with a family and you're hearing and speaking Portuguese in the street. And then I would teach a course that has the content that I'm going to talk about today on comparative or contrastive grammar of Spanish and Portuguese, on the assumption that the teachers who would go, or students, because graduate students also have gone, would know Spanish, right? And then this would be a way to build on their Spanish for learning Portuguese. So here's the link again that Mark already put in the chat. So this is just the page that you would go to if you want to look at that. And as he said, we're very thankful to Professor André São Paulo, who presented on Portuguese pronunciation, to Professor Michele Saraiva Carillo, who presented on Portuguese language pedagogy. I hope you were attended that one. That was fantastic. And today I hope to at least somewhat approximate the great job that they both did, and talk a little bit about grammar. Okay. So let me just start out with this for those of you who don't know what linguists do. So what do linguists do, right? So every linguist has a story about being on an airplane and being deathly afraid of someone sitting next to you asking you what you do for a living. And you say you're a linguist, right? And they say, oh, well, how many languages do you speak, right? And so do linguists speak a lot of languages? Well, not necessarily, right? You know, some speak a lot, some may only speak one. So that's not necessarily what linguists do. Are they grammar police? And I found this great little picture on the internet, right? To correct and serve. Are we the grammar police? Never. We don't make judgments about linguistic appropriateness. We describe, we don't prescribe. So I typically make the comparison with geologists. So geologists don't tell rocks how to be, right? And linguists don't tell speakers or their languages how to be. We're describing them in the same way that geologists are describing rocks and soil and things like that. So what are linguists? So linguists are scientists, even when, like me, housed in a humanities department, which probably some of you know can cause friction sometimes in departments. We're lucky at OSU, though, that we have pretty good understanding between the different groups in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Many linguists study linguistic variation. That's what I do. And so we want to know things like, what makes language users decide to employ one linguistic form in a given context, even when there are multiple ways of saying it in that context, right? So what leads us to say it one way and not another way that would also be possible? Probably not equivalent, but at least possible. And such decisions, especially when we're just speaking off the cuff, are made subconsciously, but they're highly patterned. It's not just random, right? We're not just saying, oh, I got 5 choices here, I'm going to pick choice 4, right? That's not how it works. So there's something else going on. And I mean, linguists do this in different ways. This is just particular to me. I investigate probabilistic patterns using huge data sets of words. There I say multi-million, but they're really over 1 billion now in some of them. And quantitative analysis, though not everyone does quantitative analysis. You don't have to do it. So the reason why I wanted to include this is...
Comfortable?
Sorry?
Huh? Good.
Oh. Okay. So let me just give you a quick example that we'll talk about more later. The case of direct object pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese, which was actually a project that we did in one of my courses. Mark was actually included in this project. So there are really 2 distinct ways, probably more than that, but we were looking at 2 distinct ways to say something like, I saw you yesterday. And neither of which appears to be more stigmatized or more formal than the other. So you could say, eu te vi ontem, so you saw yesterday, right? Literally, with an unstressed pronoun that occurs before the verb. Or you could say, eu vi você ontem, with a stressed pronoun that occurs after the verb, and that's the new pattern, right? So in Spanish, you'd only have one way to say this, right? Yo te vi ayer, right? Or ayer te vi. So we wanted to know, like, how can we determine what is leading speakers to do this? And so we, with my students and my Portuguese 5611 course, we designed a survey, we looked at natural data, we disseminated the survey via social media, and here's what we came up with. So I won't go through this for you, but this is the kind of thing that a linguist does, right? This is actually, it's like a decision tree, right? Probably all of you have seen a decision tree. And this is a decision tree that we found characterized our data. And there will be a test on this at the end of this presentation. So you know, you better memorize it. No, I'm just joking. But I mean, I won't go through this. The paper has actually already been published. And these are the different factors that determine why one person, right, or speakers would say eu te vi ontem or eu vi você ontem. And so this is what we found in that study. So I won't go through this. This is much too complex, I think, for some people here. But the point is just that we are extracting out these patterns, right? Patterns in language that we make hypotheses about them. We test the hypotheses just like any scientist would, and then we construct models. This is just one. I mean, obviously, this is just the output of the statistical program that we would later, describe and characterize in different ways. But we create models, whether they're quantitative models or qualitative models of what we think, right, is going on inside the speaker's head. We can really never know, right? The human subjects committees don't look favorably on opening people's skulls up and trying to see what decisions are being made inside of them. So we have to do this indirectly. Okay, so that is all just a basic introduction to what one kind of linguist does, right? There are other kinds of linguists, but this is just an example of what I did. I actually did that. Those slides were from a presentation I did for a group at OSU called the Decision Sciences Collective. And the new members, in the year that I was a new member, they recruited me to do a 5-minute elevator talk in front of everyone else. And basically you have to justify why you should be included as a member of the Decision Sciences Collective. And I said, well, linguistic usage, right, is a decision science. We're always making decisions on how to say things or write things or interpret, right, interpret language in different ways. So it really is a decision science. And I was sort of shocked that no one in the Decision Sciences Collective worked on language. So that was sort of my way to prove to them that that this was a decision science. Okay, so let's talk about Portuguese. So here are the Portuguese speaking countries, or at least the normally recognized ones. With their populations, though, I know at least for Brazil, this is low. It's really about 210 million now. The others I'm not as sure about, but here they are. These are their names in Portuguese. So Portugal, Brazil, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé e Príncipe, Angola, Mozambique, and Timor-Leste, which is East Timor in English. There are also regions, so the region right here in India, that's called Goa, where they traditionally spoke Portuguese. There's still street signs in Portuguese. From what I've heard, not that many people speak Portuguese fluently there anymore. But there are still vestiges of Portuguese there, and they have a lot of Portuguese customs from when Portuguese speakers were there. So these are the different countries. Obviously, Brazil dominates, right, in terms of speakers. I believe that Portuguese is the 6th most spoken language in the world. And again, with over 200 million speakers in Brazil alone. So here's just, I like including this map because if any of you have ever been to Spain and watched the weather forecast in Spain, they don't include Portugal in the map of the weather forecast in Spain. And it looks like this is all coastline of Spain, but actually they just blot out Portugal. But I wanted to show you this because the history of Portuguese actually starts here with Galician, and Galician speakers then went south. So Galician is actually the source of Portuguese, which when I first learned that was quite the shock to me because I thought Galician was something that sort of developed on its own. But before there were the borders between Spain and Portugal, these speakers, went south. And now if you go to the north of Portugal, and they speak, their Portuguese is a lot more like Galician than say speakers from down here from Lisbon or from the southern part of Portugal. So Portugal is a very small country, but there's actually a lot of diversity in how Portuguese is spoken. And it's very easy to tell when someone is from Lisbon, for example, versus from Porto, which is more up here in the north, and definitely from the farther north. So, so that is, well, this is an approximate distribution of the present day languages of the Iberian Peninsula, but that's how Portuguese came to be. So here are some of the topics that I'm going to cover for you. The pronoun system. I actually taught a course that lasted a whole semester on the pronoun system, so I can't say very much about it. But the pronoun system is very interesting and has a lot of points of difference from Spanish. I find my students who typically already know Spanish, even the undergrads have already had a lot of Spanish, they struggle with a lot of points of the pronoun system. We'll talk a little bit about subordination. So, you know, how do you put one sentence inside of another one, or the lack thereof, because that's one difference between Spanish and Portuguese, that Spanish prefers to have subordinate clauses or subordinate sentences a lot more than Portuguese does. Portuguese speakers would rather just, or at least they have a different kind of subordination, let's say that. We'll talk about how to respond to yes/no questions in Portuguese, because that's really fun and very different from Spanish. We'll talk some about tense, mood, and aspect, some very salient points, and then we'll end with talking about definite articles with proper names and possessives, which, at least with proper names, you probably, those of you who know Spanish know that there are some dialects where definite articles occur with proper names, oftentimes to say negative things about the person that you are calling La Maria or whatever. And that's not necessarily the case in Portuguese. It doesn't have that negative connotation. So the other thing I wanted to say is I'll mainly be talking about Brazilian Portuguese, but I will point out some very important parts of the grammar where Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese diverge. There are more than what I'm going to talk about, but I'll talk about some of the most salient ones within these topics. And of course, the other thing to say is, since we are Center for Latin American Studies, it makes more sense to talk about Brazilian Portuguese. But nevertheless, it is good to know that, I mean, for those of you who are in the pronunciation workshop with Andre, he talked about some of the differences, and pronunciation is actually the biggest difference between Brazilian and European Portuguese. We don't know as much about the African varieties of Portuguese, but at least my experience with them is that they're easier to understand than Portuguese from Portugal. For someone who, like me, has spent a lot of time in Brazil and with speakers of Brazilian Portuguese, I find African speakers fairly easy to understand. Okay, so let's just talk about some similarities before we get to any differences. So you'll be happy to know that there are 3 verb conjugation classes, just like in Spanish, and they are just like in Spanish, AR, ER, and IR. So taking the normal verbs that we use for illustrating these, falar, which is hablar, comer, which is the same, right? And salir, which is salir in Spanish. And there are differences. I'm not going to go through all of the conjugations for you. That would take probably the whole 2 hours. But if you don't have your own favorite online verb conjugator, I recommend Verbix. I find Verbix to be really good and really accurate, but you may have your own, or you may have your own 10,000 verb forms in Spanish or Portuguese book that you prefer. But here are just some examples so you can see. And again, if you were in the pronunciation workshop, these are pronounced differently. So yo hablo is eu falo, right? That last vowel is not an O in Portuguese, but an U. Ella come, ela come, where that O is not an O, but an A. One thing I did want to mention is that in Spanish, we have comemos in present tense and comimos in past tense, right? Preterite, but not in Portuguese. So in Portuguese, it's comemos and comemos. So you only know that it's past tense because the context tells you so. So if you just see comemos, on its own, you don't know in Portuguese whether it's present or preterite. And then ellos salen, eles saem. So here's some, they're pretty similar. It takes a while for the students to get these, especially this M right here is not really an M. It just is indicating nasalization of the vowel beforehand. And that's really hard, right? Trying to teach students who've never had to nasalize anything, to nasalize vowels can be pretty difficult. So word order, I could probably say a lot more about this. So it is pretty much subject, verb, object, like Spanish. But I do want to mention that in Brazilian Portuguese, there is much less flexibility than in most dialects of Spanish. Maybe if you know a Caribbean dialect of Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese is more like a Caribbean dialect of Spanish in terms of wanting to be in subject, verb, object order. So I put this question here. So this means que quieres, right? O que você quer? So notice that in Spanish, you might say que quieres tú with the tú after the verb, but in Portuguese, o que quer você sounds extremely weird. It's much more normal to put the subject before the verb. So o que você quer? Now, what do you want? Has this subject, verb, object order. And then there's much shared lexicon between the two languages with, some minor differences between them, but a lot of cognates. There are some false cognates too, but I'd say most of them are true cognates. So we'll start out looking at, so these are the personal pronouns from written language. I put most of the titles in Portuguese because I think they're transparent enough for you to know if you're a Spanish speaker, reader, to know what they say, right? So personal pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese, written, or this is written or formal language. So there are a few things to say here, such as these pronouns here, which we normally call clitic pronouns or atonic pronouns. Not all of them are used anymore. A lot of them have faded by the wayside in Brazilian Portuguese. Same goes for some of the ones here. I probably could have included, but I didn't think I would have enough time to talk about reflexive pronouns. In Brazilian Portuguese, a lot of things that you would think would be reflexive because of your knowledge of Spanish are not. So let's just have a little participation here. So how would you ask someone to marry you in Spanish? If anyone wants to speak up and say that.
Casate conmigo.
Right. Casate conmigo, if you're from Argentina. Or casate conmigo, right? Or te quieres casar conmigo. right? But in all of those cases, we have that te pronoun, right? Marry yourself with me. Well, in Brazilian Portuguese, they don't do that. They say casa comigo without the te, or você quer casar comigo without any reflexive pronoun. And there are a lot others, right, besides that, where you would typically use a reflexive in Spanish, but at least in spoken Brazilian Portuguese, you wouldn't. So this is the written or formal language, and then we have spoken or informal language in Brazilian Portuguese. There are a lot of other possibilities here. Lots of things come into play, how educated people are, where they're from, et cetera, just like anywhere else. But more or less, this is sort of the spoken language system with subjects. So we'll talk about some of these in a minute. But so you can see, for example, for subject, you have this word, which is pronounced nos or nois, depending on where you're from. And then it looks like this is the same word, but it doesn't have an accent on it because it's a clitic pronoun. So it can't be stressed. And so it's actually pronounced as nous instead of nos. And then over here, sort of the same thing. We'll talk about this thing, a gente, which looks like la gente, but has a completely different meaning. Você and vocês, right? Those might remind you of, well, on the one hand, they might remind you of vos. And on the other hand, they might remind you of usted and ustedes, right? And it actually has a very similar source to usted and ustedes. So você comes from vossa mercê, and just like usted originally comes from vuestra merced in Spanish, and those two words fused together and gave us usted, and vossa mercê in Portuguese fused together and became você. But it's not a formal pronoun like usted. And then we'll talk about você and tu also in a minute. So let's talk about these subjects for a second. So in Latin, the first person singular subject, and now we use it to mean something different, but it was ego, right? And now we talk about people having an ego. Well, they have a big first person singular, right? And in Spanish, that became yo. So that was one modification of ego. And in Portuguese, it became eu. Right. So this is like, I tell my students who have trouble with this, I tell them just to say like, ew, right? Like they would say to something gross. And then, gradually switch from ew to ew. And so these are just different results, right, of the modification over time of Latin ego, right? So now we talk about ego in English. So let's talk for a second now about the second singular, right? The you singular pronoun. So you might already know that você is the normative form in Brazil. It's not the normative form in Portugal. And it seems to be gaining more and more acceptance in Portugal, but for quite a while, it had negative connotations associated with it in Portugal. And why is this the normative form? Well, how do things become the normative or the prestige form in a language? Well, they become that way because of who speaks that way, right? I'm glad we have Raquel here to use voceo forms, because I tell my students, if we had a border with Argentina instead of Mexico, you would all be learning vos instead of tú, right? I mean, it's sort of a historical and geographical accident that we're teaching this sort of, watered down Mexican sort of neutral, supposedly Spanish. But if we had a border with a voceo country, things would be quite different. At least that's my opinion, right? So vocé is typical of these southeastern Brazil prestige dialects, namely Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, right? These are three big principal cities that are reasonably close to each other, right? It's easy to hop on a plane and fly, it's like 35 minutes, right? From Rio to Sao Paulo or back. So I think that's why, right? I mean, that's really why vocé is considered the normative form, but a lot of speakers use tú. So I don't know if Michele is still here, but Michele, who did our second workshop, is from the South, from Rio Grande do Sul. And I bet that she never uses vocé in a natural manner. She uses tú. Tú is found in the South with millions of speakers, in the Northeast with millions of speakers, and in the North, for example, in the city of Belém, which is the far northern point of Brazil. So there are millions of speakers who use tú in Brazil, right? Same as we can say about voceo in Latin America, right? I think Terrell Morgan, in some research with others, found that their estimate was 130. There were 130 million speakers of voceo in Latin America. I don't know if there are 130 million Brazilians who use tú, probably not, but there are millions of them. Now, some dialects and speakers will use both of these pronouns. They'll use both vocé and tú. So this is, for example, almost a stereotype of people from Rio de Janeiro who are known as cariocas. They will switch back and forth. I've had the same speaker in the same conversation talking only to me use both vocé and tú while talking to me. And there are some attempts at explanation for why that is. I'm not totally convinced about those reasons, but you will see that. The important thing to know, though, is that most speakers who use the tú pronoun will combine it with third singular verb conjugation. So they'll use the same verb conjugation that they use for vocé with tú. So just like in Spanish, the normative, right, the prescriptive grammar conjugation for tú and saber would be tú sabes. But people don't tend to say that. They tend to just say tú sabe or tú sabe, right? So it sounds like Caribbean Spanish speakers, but Brazilians don't aspirate that S at the end of sabes, right? They just say tú sabe. So if you end up, I've had students who ended up doing study abroad or doing a summer program in a region where they use tú, and they come back using tú, but they didn't have to learn how to conjugate the verb differently because they'd already learned it for vocé, and they just use the same verb conjugation. So I think, you can learn to use both depending on where you are, but you don't have to learn how to do those specific conjugations for tú. Now, Portuguese is also considered, like Spanish, a null subject language, but this is very misleading and very different depending on what we're talking about. So Brazilian Portuguese is much closer to an overt subject language. The studies that I've seen say 75 to 80% overt subject. So that means people are saying the pronoun, right? So, when you teach English speakers Spanish, you have to teach them, you don't have to keep repeating the pronoun over and over again. You don't have to keep saying I, or you. Well, when a Spanish speaker learns Portuguese, they have to learn to put that pronoun back in, because typically they will use it. And you're always safe using it for Brazilian Portuguese. European Portuguese is completely different. It's very much similar to dialects of Spanish, for example, like Spanish from Spain. They only use about 20% overt pronouns in European Portuguese. So again, and some people have talked about this, this is a case where Brazilian Portuguese actually resembles Caribbean dialects of Spanish, using more overt subjects than other dialects of Spanish or European Portuguese. Nevertheless, this percentage is much higher than Caribbean dialects of Spanish, the studies that I know of, that typically say 40 to 50% overt for Caribbean dialects of Spanish. It's much higher for Brazilian Portuguese. So here are just some examples. I found this online. This is the use of tu with the third singular conjugation. So this says, you want to use coconut oil, thinking that that's going to be healthier. Go ahead and use it. You want to use milk, swearing that milk is, or get rid of milk, swearing that milk is inflammatory, then get rid of it, right? You want to think that coconut sugar is healthier, then go ahead and think that, right? So here we have tu quer, right? Quer is the third singular conjugation. It's the one you see with você, right? So it's not tu queres, or tu queres, as they would say in Portugal, right? It's tu quer in each case. And another interesting thing here, we won't talk about this very much, but these are actually at the end, uzi, chiri, ashi. Those are actually the imperative forms for você, and they're using them with the tu pronoun, which is another very common phenomenon, very common mixture. So normative grammarians of Portuguese will talk very negatively about what they call mistura de pronomes, right? Pronoun mixture. And that's something to be avoided like the plague, right? Don't mix your forms, the forms that go with tu and the forms that go with você. Keep them separate. The truth is that nobody can do that. And even in Portugal, they don't do it. With the plurals, for example, they mix forms from different pronouns with the plurals. So this whole thing about prescriptive grammar saying don't mix your pronouns, it's pretty much impossible not to. Okay, so let's talk about object pronouns, because these can be quite different from Spanish. So in Brazilian Portuguese, these what we call clitic pronouns or atonic pronouns, pronombres átonos, nearly always occur before the verb, right? So eu os vi, I saw them. Ele me deu carro, he gave me a car, right? So just like in Spanish, you have yo los vi, right? Él me dio carro. It's pretty much the same. In European Portuguese, the clitic pronouns, these same pronouns occur after the verb. And you will see these also in written Brazilian Portuguese. So if you've studied any Old Spanish, you know that in Old Spanish, this was where the pronouns used to go as well. They used to go after the verb, and they don't anymore. But in European Portuguese, they would say, they might not use the subject to begin with, but they would say vius or vius, or deu-me carro, okay, with those after the verb. There's a set of triggers. They call them triggers, ativadores in Portuguese, or gatilhos in Portuguese. Things like negation, adverbs, complementizers that supposedly move these enclitics to position before the verb, right? So in European Portuguese, if you say vius, if you put in negation, then you should move that us and put it before the verb and say, não os vi. Same thing, I did it here with the adverb já, which is already, just like ya in Spanish. Ele já me deu carro. Okay. Nevertheless, I had a student study this in her dissertation, looking at European Portuguese, and she found that people are not, as you might expect, not paying as much attention to these rules anymore. And a lot of times they're leaving the pronouns after the verb, like in these examples. She even found a lot of examples in newspapers. So it's even sort of moving its way into more formal, written styles. Okay, now let's talk about one of my favorite things. One of my favorite things is actually invisible, because it's null direct objects. So, or in Portuguese, objetos diretos nulos. And you find this both in Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, and I assume in African varieties of Portuguese as well. Speakers overwhelmingly prefer to, and then I put in quotes, drop, right? And they prefer not to say the pronoun when it's an inanimate direct object. Right, as long as this can be inferred from the context, right? They're not out there trying to fool anyone. But you could say something like this. Ontem vi carro muito legal e hoje vou comprar. Right, so yesterday I saw a very cool car and today I'm going to buy. Right, and that it that you would expect to be there is not there. And in fact, if you put it there, it would sound very formal, very stilted. It would sound like written language, right? I don't think a native speaker would put anything here. They would just say, ontem vi carro muito legal e hoje vou comprar. Okay? This is less common though, right? So here we have an inanimate object, a car, right? But when you talk about humans or domestic animals, like people's pets, what will Brazilian Portuguese speakers do? Well, they won't use those other pronouns that we saw before, like the o and the os, or the u, pronounced u and us. They'll use the subject pronouns for direct object function, at least in the spoken language. So if I here change a car for a dog, so cachorro is any dog in Portuguese. It's not a puppy like it is in Spanish, right? Ontem vi cachorro muito legal e hoje vou comprar ele. All right, so when I tell my students about this, right, this is actually an innovation in Brazilian Portuguese. I tell them this is like us in English saying, yesterday I saw a really cool dog and today I'm going to buy he, right? That's what it would sound like to someone from Portugal, because they cannot put this subject pronoun in this place where it's a direct object of the verb comprar. Or with a person, você viu minha irmã ontem? So did you see my sister? Irmã is hermana, yesterday. Eu vou ver ela semana que vem. I'm going to see her, right? So this would literally be, I'm going to see she next week, okay? So my experience with Spanish speakers here is they want to use the clitic pronouns because they've been drilled for so long on clitic pronouns, on lo and los and la and las and you know, the whole set of them. And, you know, they finally get them right. And then they come into Portuguese class and we say, no, please don't use them, right? And so we actually have to have them practice these dropping sentences, right? Dropping this pronoun and teach them not to use it. So this is a really fun part, I think, of learning Portuguese for a Spanish speaker, but it can also be frustrating for a Spanish speaker. So here's an example that I found where, so it says, look at this couple that lives in my mother's house. And o Gil is the name of this person's dog. And she says, o Gil ama, loves eles, loves them also, right? And using eles, which is the subject pronoun for this. Okay, so here's an exercise. I won't have you do it, but just so you can see the type of exercise that that we might use with learners. And one of the things that you might have noticed so far is how different the spoken language of Brazilian Portuguese is compared to the written language. Basically, the written language, the normative grammar, which is always based on written language, right, is pretty much the same as in Portugal. And Brazilians often complain. They say, you know, why are we learning all this stuff that we would never say? And I don't blame them. But for our students, sometimes, you know, they need to learn how to write in a more formal style in Portuguese. So this is one exercise that I've used with them where they have to replace this italicized word or phrase with a pronoun. So in the first case, I'm asking them to use atonic or clitic pronoun following the norma culta, right? So following the prescriptive rules. And in the second, I have them replace that phrase the way it would be in spoken Brazilian Portuguese. So in each of these cases, it would be different, right? And I say, pay attention to the position of the pronoun in the phrase, because that can be very different, whether it appears before the verb or after the verb, right? So, so in these cases, you have different choices for the written standard and then sort of the normal way of speaking. Because a lot of the students come in and they say, well, I want to study abroad in Brazil and I want to be able to speak and I want to be able to understand. Or they already studied abroad and they come back and they're speaking this beautiful, everyday colloquial Portuguese, but they might not have learned the formal grammar part yet. That seems to be pretty typical for some of our undergrads. Okay, so let's now talk about a gente. So that looks like la gente because it is, right? It does mean, a gente does mean the people. But usually when you hear it, a Brazilian Portuguese speaker is not talking about the people, they're talking about we. They're using it as the first person plural pronoun, and it means we instead of the people. So this is a very important innovation in Brazilian Portuguese, if you want to speak like a Brazilian, you have to learn to use a gente, either instead of or in addition to nós, which is we. And you might actually never or only very rarely hear nós in the spoken language. Much more common for Brazilian speakers to say a gente. And the interesting thing is it takes third singular conjugation. So it still takes the same conjugation that it took when it meant only la gente, right? So if you want to say we sleep, you say a gente dorme, right? Which sounds like the people sleep, but it means we sleep. It is possible to find it with first plural conjugation, like a gente dormimos. But I tell my students that this is socially stigmatized. And probably the university educated or being educated students that you'll be around when you study abroad in Brazil will not accept you saying a gente dormimos. Because it's stigmatized to combine the first person plural conjugation with a gente when it means we. When I was first learning about this and learning Portuguese, I said, well, what's the atonic pronoun? What's the clitic pronoun that goes with a gente? Well, there isn't one. I wanted there to be, right? I wanted there to be this beautiful symmetry in the paradigm between this, but it's always a gente, whether it's subject, direct object, indirect object, or an oblique, an object of a preposition, right? So if I say, vocês viram a gente ontem, did y'all see us yesterday? A gente viu vocês, we saw you, okay? Or esse presente, this present, they don't say regalo, they say presente, right? Esse presente é para a gente, right? That present is for us. Or os carros são da gente. The cars are ours, right? Da gente. Da is actually the preposition de, usually pronounced G in speech, plus the article a, right? So they actually fuse those two things together. If you know Italian, for example, or French, right? They have cases where the preposition and the article get fused together, and Portuguese does too. Okay, we're about halfway through time-wise. Is everyone doing okay? Anyone need a break?
Scott, I did have a question on this slide. Could you talk about if you ever get nos with a gente endings with third singular conjugation?
Yes, you can. It's equally stigmatized.
Right.
As it's equally so you can get nos dorme. There's actually a lot of memes out there with nos plus third person singular. Mm-hmm. But I think they're just for hilarity's sake, right? They're to be funny. But it is possible to get nos dorme. So that switch with just as you get a gente dormimos, but they're both stigmatized unless you're joking around. Like I said, there's a lot of memes out there that have the combination of a third person singular verb and nos, the we pronoun. Raquel?
Yes, Scott, another question, maybe the hateful question, the why question in classes. Is there any reason that you have been detected for this shift to a gente? Sounds to me to la gente in Spanish and in Argentina has become very common, especially because of the political hit to change like o povo by a gente, you know, like el pueblo versus la gente, and la gente is is the public of TV, you know, and this kind of divas from TV talking in name of la gente and using these political effects, but it's very kind of like entangled with politics in Argentina. And I have observed, I'm not a linguist, sorry, but I have observed the change.
Yeah.
Kind of the
That's really interesting. I haven't heard of that. You do get a gente, of course they pronounce it as a gente in Portugal as well. So it's not only in Brazil, but in Brazil it's sort of taken off and become the normal way to say we. And I don't think that there's, you know, any kind of socio-political trigger for that in the same way. I think it just comes from people wanting to use an impersonal sort of expression, but they're included in the group. So, you know, if you say something like la gente quiere in Spanish, well, that's me, right? I'm one of those people included in the group. And I think that's probably what happened. And I think as a consequence of that, just as you mentioned el pueblo in Spanish, when you talk about la gente in Brazilian Portuguese, people tend to say, instead of a gente, they say as pessoas, right? Las personas. Or they say o pessoal, no? El personal. We don't say a gente. They tend to avoid it because now the interpretation of it is as we.
Okay.
Right? In the written language, probably not as much, right? Because this is still mainly a spoken language phenomenon, but it's not stigmatized in the way that some of the other things that I've mentioned are stigmatized.
And we are talking about what? How long, Scott? We're talking about 2 decades, 5 decades. What
oh no, longer than that. Longer than that. So in linguistics, we typically only think in centuries. Because linguistic change is so slow.
Oh, so this phenomena that you're describing here, it's like, okay.
Yeah. And again, like I said, it's in Portugal as well. So it probably started there, but then it got to Brazil. And like so many changes in language, when a language gets moved from one place to another, a lot of times certain things sort of snowball. Right. And I think that's what's happened here with a gente in Brazilian Portuguese. And it's just sort of taken on this. I mean, there's more complex theories to talk about in terms of linguistics. For example, it just seems like Brazilian Portuguese loves to use what we would call tonic pronouns or full pronouns you can stress. And it wants to get rid of basically the clitic pronouns or the atonic pronouns that Spanish loves, right? It really seems to be a big, you know, it's just a difference between the two languages. So I think that might be part of it as well. So I don't know sort of the origin story though, but I'm sure there's a whole book on a gente. Written by a Brazilian linguist who I know pretty well, and I don't recall what she says, but I'm sure it's in there about how it started. Okay, let's see. Okay, so all right, so we'll stop with pronouns there. Now let's talk a little bit about what happens when you want to combine two sentences together, sort of the main clause, subordinate clause type structure, or main clause, complement clause, whatever terminology you might have learned, right? So first of all, if you look at something like a number one, right? In English, we say, I want to go. In Spanish, we say, quiero ir. In Portuguese, we say, quero ir. And here it's the same subject. The person who wants and the person who's going to go is the same, right? So if I say quiero ir, that means quiero yo ir, right? When you switch to a different subject, you get different options. So in English, you still get the same structure with to go. You say, I want you to go. I guess in theory, we could say, I want that you go, but that sounds like Shakespeare, right? That sounds like something from a long time ago. No one talks like that in any dialect of English that I know of. Does anyone say, I want that you go? If someone said that to me, I'd stop in my tracks and say, wait a minute, where are you from? Why are you saying that? So in Spanish, when you do this, you know that you have to have this subordinate sentence and you use the subjunctive, right? Quiero que vayas. So I want that you go. Same thing in Portuguese. Quiero que você vá. I want you to go. But you have this other thing in Portuguese that I want to talk about with this heavy use of infinitives and this particular verb form that's called the personal infinitive, which is an infinitive with a conjugation ending. And if you know what an infinitive means not finite or not conjugatable, right? That's what infinitive means. But you have a form in Portuguese that you can actually conjugate. So here's an example. So, eles trabalham para vencer ou para vencerem na vida. You can say either one. So they work in order to be successful or whatever in life. Okay. So you have these two choices. And this one is just a regular old infinitive. It looks just like the same verb in Spanish. But then you have this form, vencerem, where this em actually is an agreement marker with eles, with second or with third person plural, right? So this is ellos trabajan, okay? So Portuguese loves infinitives so much, they created conjugations for them, right? And these don't have necessarily the same interpretation. So eles trabalham para vencer na vida, right? That's they work in order to be successful, to conquer in life. But the idea is, well, everybody does, right? Whereas eles trabalham para vencerem na vida is they work so that those same people, can be successful at life, okay? So it's a little bit different interpretation. And so what I want you to see here is there's this continuum of finite subordination, where finite subordination is saying something like quiero que vayas, right? With a que and then another conjugated verb after it. And English is probably the one that hates that the most. So like I said, we don't say, I want that you go in English, at least not anymore. Portuguese is sort of in between because it has both of these options. And Spanish prefers, in a lot of places, to do quiero que vayas. So Spanish actually prefers this finite subordination. So we like to torture our students in Spanish with que and subjunctive verb forms after them, till they're blue in the face trying to remember all of the subjunctive conjugations. Okay, so like I said, Portuguese and its speakers just love infinitives. They love them so much, they have two different kinds. They have impersonal infinitives, which is like the normal old infinitive that you find in Spanish. And they have personal infinitives, which is this one that I said has a special ending on it. So this form, vencerem, is known as the infinitivo flexionado, so conjugated infinitive, or infinitivo pessoal, personal infinitive. And in Brazilian Portuguese, only 2 different forms can take this ending. So for second plural or third plural, you get this ending em, like you saw here. And for first singular, you get this ending mos, M-O-S. And in European Portuguese, where they actually do conjugate all the verb forms for tu, this same thing, if we switch it to tu, to second singular, it would be tu trabalhas para venceres na vida, right? And well, I guess I should say that in European Portuguese, right? Tu trabalhas para venceres na vida. So if you've ever heard European Portuguese, it sounds a lot like a Slavic language, like Polish, because all the vowels seem to be missing. So, so here we have compare these sentences with the personal infinitive and their subjunctive counterparts, right? So, eu posso ficar aqui até eles chegarem. So I can stay here until, so até is hasta, until they get here. Or eu posso ficar aqui até que eles cheguem, right? This is what Spanish would do, right? Puedo quedarme aquí hasta que lleguen, right? In Spanish. And it's possible to do that in Portuguese, right? Here's the sentence. But it's much more preferred to say the version in A with the infinitive. Okay. Same thing here. Ela pediu para nós ficarmos aqui. So she asked us to stay here with the personal infinitive. Here it's first person plural, we, right? So ficar is to stay plus the mus. Or you could have the subjunctive, ela pediu que nós ficássemos aqui, right? So, ella pidió que nos quedáramos aquí, or nos quedásemos. I would never say it that way, but nos quedáramos aquí, okay? So Portuguese highly prefers, right? So all of that time you spent with your Spanish students, teaching them to use subjunctive in these hasta que or pidió que contexts, you don't have to do that for Portuguese. You can just teach them to use the infinitive. That's what native speakers would do. So, so here's just to give you the paradigm for these personal infinitives, right? So, like I said, in Brazil, they don't tend to use conjugations with tu very often. So it'd be para eu ser, para você, or para tu ser. It's not para ti, it's para tu ser. Para ele ser, para nós sermos, para a gente ser, para vocês serem, para eles serem, right? And then here's the normative one. You would find this in Portugal, right? Para tu seres. So that's what the infinitive looks like. So, and then here are just some examples with the most common prepositions. And I think the thing that to notice here is that these prepositions in Spanish would take que plus the subjunctive after them, right? So hasta que, para que, antes de que, para que again, sin que, sin is sin. So all of these cases where in Spanish you would teach with the que and then a conjugated verb after, in Portuguese you would get the infinitive and the personal infinitive in the cases like, let me look at this one. So antes de vocês irem, so before you guys go, vamos cortar o bolo, we're going to cut the cake. Okay, now let's talk about responding, because this is really fun. And there's one simple rule for Spanish speakers and English speakers. Don't say sim when you are asked a yes/no question in Portuguese, because that's not what native speakers say, right? So Spanish languages are different in how they respond. Spanish is what is called a particle response language. So in Spanish, you say, someone asks you a yes/no question, you say sí or you say no, right? That's all you have to do. But Portuguese, and this is true for both Brazil and Portugal, is what's called an echo repetition language. And apparently vulgar Latin was like this, and this is left over. So, back to Raquel's question about how far things go back. This goes back a long way. So Portuguese decided to conserve this vulgar Latin way of responding. So how do you do it? Well, you have to take the conjugated verb from the question and you have to respond modifying its conjugation. So if someone asks me, gostou da comida, did you like the food? I would just say, gostei, I liked. Okay, so I took the verb form, I took the verb gostou, which is from gostar, which is like gustar, gostou da comida, and then I changed it to first person singular and I say gostei. You can do it for third person too. Ela chegou na hora. So did she arrive on time? Chegou. She did. Vocês foram à praia? Did you guys go to the beach? Fomos. We went. That's how you respond to a yes/no question in Portuguese. You could add the sim after if you want to, if someone asks you, gostou da comida? Like that stuff is disgusting, right? And you could say, gostei sim. I really liked it. I really did, right? Contrary to what you were expecting, I liked it. You can put that sim after the verb. And I didn't put this on here, but in Portugal, they actually repeat this twice when it's counter to someone's expectation. So in Portugal, if someone asks you, gostei da comida, like that stuff was really gross, you say, gostei, gostei. You just repeat it. Or ela chegou na hora, like I'm asking you if she arrived. I don't think she got there on time. You say, chegou, chegou. Just say it twice. And that means, yes, she did, contrary to what you were thinking. Okay, so that's pretty cool too. So what about negatives? This is another one of my favorite topics. I could talk about this for probably a month, nonstop. But I'll just say this. It's extremely common when you respond negatively to double the negative. So same questions that we had before. Gostou da comida? Não gostei não. Ela chegou na hora? Não chegou não. Vocês foram à praia? Não fomos não. Very typical for Brazilian Portuguese speakers to respond with that doubling of the negative. You can respond just with no on its own, right? So you can say, like down here, vocês foram à praia? No. It's fine. Much more common to respond with the no in the negative than with the sim in the affirmative. Okay. All right. So that was a quick, so very different, right, from what you would, in English, we would just say, did you like the food? Yeah. Right. In Spanish, ¿te gustó la comida? Sí. That's all you have to say, right? But in Portuguese, it's different. You usually respond with the verb. All right, now let's talk. Don't have a ton of time, but we'll go quickly through tense, aspect, and mood. I'm going to start with the present perfect. In Portuguese, it's called presente perfeito. And the reason why I want to start with this is a big false friend from Portuguese to Spanish. There's actually no form or construction in Portuguese that expresses the present perfect meaning. So in English, we have the have plus past participle. In Spanish, there's haber plus past participle, but those do not mean the same thing, at least not in the present, as Portuguese ter plus past participle, right? I didn't put this in there, but you do, haver, which is haber, but with a V, does exist as well, but it's only used for past perfect. So it's only, you only use haber plus past participle when you're saying había comido in Spanish, right? Or more typically writing, because in speaking you wouldn't use it probably very much, but in writing it still persists. But it doesn't show up at all for present, so they use ter. So how do you say something like, I have been to Brazil? Well, in Spanish, we'd say, he estado en Brasil, or he ido a Brasil, right? But what would the Portuguese version say? And Portuguese uses the simple past form here, typically with an adverb like já. So you would say something like, eu já fui ao Brasil, or eu já estive no Brasil here. And of course, there are some dialects of Spanish that prefer to do this too. So, you know, Mexican Spanish, Argentine Spanish don't use a ton of haber plus past participle compared to, you know, the really extreme is Spain, but also Andean dialects of Spanish use a lot of haber plus past participle. But in Portuguese, and it doesn't matter where, they don't use it. So what does this ter plus past participle thing mean, right? And this is hard for students to understand. So if you say something like, eu tenho comido muito, that means I've been eating a lot lately, okay? Portanto, tenho engordado. As a result, I've been getting fatter. So it has this meaning that in English we do with have been plus ing form, right? So eu tenho comido muito, portanto tenho engordado would translate as I've been eating a lot lately. As a result, I've been getting fatter, right? Typical pandemic sentence. Though hopefully that we won't have to go through that again, right? Or something like eles têm dormido monte nesse mês, right? They've been sleeping. Monte is montão, right? Monte nesse mês. No, they've been sleeping a lot this month. So it has this meaning of something that started in the past and continues and iterates right into the present, right? So very different from what we find for Spanish. Now, the other perfect forms, like if you use the past perfect or the future perfect, have similar meanings to the corresponding Spanish forms. So you're pretty safe with those. But this one, and you know, I hear students or Spanish speakers do it all the time, right? Where they say something like, sorry. Where they say something like eu tenho comido muito to mean he comido mucho hoy, right? And it cannot have that meaning in Portuguese, right? It has to mean I've been eating a lot. So let's also talk about the participles. So at first glance, the participles seem really easy because they're formed with ado and ido, right? So I'm talking about the past participles as in Spanish. But there are many, many irregular participles, and there's a whole class of irregulars that don't look like anything in Spanish. So these forms can occur with ter, so with the perfect construction, as adjectives with estar, or with in passives with ser, right? So you can either say tenho pagado or tenho pago, está pagado or está pago, foi pagado, foi pago, right? So I've been paying is this one. It's paid. or it was paid, right? In with foi. Foi is fue. So the prescriptive rule is that the do forms like pagado occur with ter, and the irregular forms like pago occur as adjectives or in passives. But again, speakers don't cooperate, and they use the irregular forms all over the place. Sorry. So here's a good example that I found that someone posted. So, quantas vidas poderiam ter sido salvas, right? Instead of salvadas, right? Which is also possible here. But it's much more common to use this, this form. So I want to just do a little quiz here. So here are some recent Twitter examples of innovative participles. So these are not found in any dictionary, but people are using them, okay? And we found these searching in Brazil, right? For Brazil Twitter. So here we have some examples like ultimamente as coisas têm chego até mim muito fácil. Se eu não tivesse falo aquilo hoje, seria bem diferente. Se eu soubesse, teria fico em casa. Me sinto como se caminhão tivesse passo. So no dictionary has these. This should be chegado, falado, ficado, and passado. But people are creating them. Can anyone guess what the model is for these innovations? Like, where are these coming from? And you find these are super easy to find. Mark can't answer here. He's not allowed.
I don't know if I'm right, but what I'm saying is that they are doing the same thing that you were showing us before when we were talking about the infinitivo personal, like they are putting the same conjugation that they have at the beginning.
Well, but they're using this, right? So what does chego, what does that look like? And falo, what does that look like? What other verb, what other use does that have?
No es el presente.
Exacto, right? So
Okay.
this is eu chego, eu falo,
Eu falo.
eu fico, eu passo. And most of the irregular participles have a form that's very similar, if not identical, to the first person singular present indicative form. And so that's what they're doing. And they know that there are other participles that are accepted that have this form. And I've talked to native speakers with very high levels of education, and I ask them, would you say tem chego or tem chegado? And they'll say, oh my God, I don't know. Because it's so natural for them to want to turn those participles into forms like chego that follow this model of other forms like pago, right? So pago, tenho pago, is the same as eu pago. And so that seems to be what native speakers of Brazilian Portuguese, you don't find this, or I haven't found it in Portugal very much, but in Brazil, I found it a lot, where these speakers are innovating. Mm-hmm.
We have if Ricardo is still here, I don't know, Ricardo, if he is from Brazil.
Uh-huh.
He's one of our students. I don't know if he's still here.
Yeah. Well, there's other native speakers here.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and you find that it's all over the place. Chego, I think, is the one that might be next to be accepted and end up in the dictionary. The other ones I'm not so sure about, but chego I see all the time. But you know, in strictly speaking, it's wrong.
And Scott, I'd be interested to hear what some of our native speaker participants have to say about sentences where you actually get it pluralized. So you can find, we have cases in that paper where they say something like, os meus pais tinham chegos.
Yes.
Where they make chego
Yes.
agree as if it were an adjective with the
Yes.
subject. It's a little bit like había, habían in Spanish, where people just like
Yes.
to have agreement. But
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear what maybe Michele and Hikaru have to say about that use.
Yeah.
Well, if I could, I think the thing is that we tend to make up those rules, and as you said, we tend to use them, and then we try to make sense of them with the other rules that we already know.
Yeah,
so therefore, oh, this should be plural. Let's just use plural. Although, as you said, chego or falo fico is not something that you would be appropriate grammatically speaking. I also I was thinking about subjunctive, because it's very easy and very common to see people say, você quer que eu faço? Você quer que eu falo? Right? And that happens as well when you talk about another person. Just você quer que ela fala? Você quer que eles falam? And we know that that's not a conjugation, but it's used, and you know, it's become more and more common.
I just saw a dissertation on that, and it's actually, it was comparing Maranhão and Sao Paulo, and there was way more of that in Sao Paulo than in Maranhão.
For sure, yeah. And also, if you were talking about before the lack of reflexive for example, the verb get married, right? I'm from a border state. We use the reflexive,
right?
So I think because we are so close to Spanish-speaking countries, we tend to use, like, I was trying to remember if my friends or myself, we would say eu caso without the me or without the te, and I couldn't. And actually, as my husband would just say eu casei or eu me casei, and say, oh, me casei, and say, yeah, of course. So it also depends where you are located, of course. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Brazil is huge, and when you have over 200 million speakers, not everyone's going to do the same thing, but definitely you hear way less reflexives in general than in Spanish.
Yeah, so, I think I think Tiffany said that in Floripa, that they would be like tu and você used, you know, like just willy-nilly, and for us, and Floripa is just above us, like one state, and it's just for us, we wouldn't use você naturally, you know, we do artificially when we don't want to sound rude to people from other states.
It's crazy, right? That you can be so geographically close and yet so different linguistically. I mean, some of that has to do with migration patterns too. Who got there when? So yeah. All right. So let's go on from that. So you guys guessed, right? The analogical model is really, they're taking first person singular indicative, which is what the accepted irregular participles already look like, and they're just extending it to new ones, right? And that's what we're seeing here. Okay, so I'll just talk quickly about the future. Some of you might have seen Raíssa Leal, the skateboarder who won silver for Brazil. She's quite the worldwide phenomenon, but especially in Brazil. And on her Instagram the other day, she had this. It said, amanhã, so tomorrow, starting at 1900 hours, irei fazer uma live com fãs. Vamos? So I will do a live, right, with fans. Okay, but this is what I want you to see, this irei fazer. So the future in Portuguese is pretty much like Spanish, And if you're from Latin America, you probably don't use what we call the synthetic future, like are, in speech very much. You might use it in writing, but in general in Latin America, that form is going by the wayside, at least for future meaning. It still sticks around for things like, you know, será idiota or something like that, which you also have in Portuguese. So they have fare, this is just for the verb fazer, right? They have fare, they have faço, so they have the present used for future very frequently. I know you can do this in Spanish, but, and I don't know of any studies that have looked at this, but at least my intuition is you get a lot more of this in Brazilian Portuguese than you do in Spanish. So, you know, using the present to talk about something in the future, like, you know, amanhã faço, so tomorrow I do something, just with the present. Then you have vou fazer, and notice that unlike in Spanish, you don't have an a, right? So in Spanish, you have voy a hacer, but in Portuguese, there's no a. But this is what Raíssa used, this iré fazer. She's actually from the far north. She's from the state of Maranhão. And she uses iré fazer. So this is actually the synthetic future, right? I will go, just like in Spanish, iré, plus the infinitive, right? And this is, I've never seen this anywhere except in Brazil. This is a Brazilian Portuguese hybrid innovation where people are using this form plus the infinitive, even though vou fazer would be perfectly fine in this particular post. Amanhã a partir das 19 horas vou fazer uma live com Faz. Totally fine. But you see this a lot, this hybrid innovation, and it doesn't look like anything, at least not anything common in Spanish. Okay, I want to talk too quickly about the progressive, because the progressive in Portuguese is used a lot more than in Spanish. It's formed the same way. Oh, this is just my own dislike of calling the ando form. I know grammars call it a gerund, but a gerund is actually an ando form used as a noun. So I'll call it a present participle. But so just like in Spanish, the present participle in Brazilian Portuguese is an NDO form. So it's the same form. But there's a difference in that in Brazilian Portuguese, the progressive is often used with stative verbs, unlike in Spanish. So you can say something like, estou sabendo do exame amanhã, right? Estou sabiendo del examen mañana. It's not impossible in Spanish, but man, you'd have to have a really, really special context for that to work, right? Or os dias estão sendo muito longos. Los días están siendo muy largos, right? Very rare. So saber, ser, those are both stative verbs, or probably the most typical one, estamos gostando muito da sua disciplina. So we're really liking your course, right? So you'll notice that, I think, for Spanish speakers, you'll notice in Brazilian Portuguese a lot more use of progressives, where you probably wouldn't use it in Spanish, with verbs where you wouldn't use it. Now, this is, I wanted to mention this difference between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, because you're bound to see it sooner or later. So in European Portuguese, they don't use the NDO form anymore. In fact, it's considered archaic for them. Instead, they use estar a plus the infinitive. So in European Portuguese, if someone says, estou a comer, that's the same as Brazilian Portuguese, estou comendo, right? Or Spanish, estoy comiendo, okay? So it's, again, the verb estar a plus the infinitive, which gives you the progressive meaning. And so why doesn't Brazil do this? Well, this was an innovation in Portugal in the 18th century, but it actually didn't become fully established until the 20th century. So it actually never made it to Brazil, right? Brazil kept the old way of doing it. Now, if you go to Portugal and say estou comendo, they'll totally understand you, right? They won't say that it's wrong. They won't say, I don't know what you're saying. Well, they might say it's wrong, but they won't tell you they don't know what you're saying. Like it's completely understandable. But this is really interesting because this is an innovation that was so late that there wasn't enough immigration of Portuguese to Brazil once that was established. Okay, I'm not going to say much about the present subjunctive because it's pretty similar. I did include this though if you want to look at it later in the PowerPoint, just some of the most common irregular verbs. As Michele said, and it's pretty well known that the present subjunctive is dying out in a lot of contexts in Brazilian Portuguese. So that's another place where, obviously you have to teach it to your students, but you can say, hey, if you don't use it there, probably no one will care if you use the indicative there. But here are just like in Spanish, right? The most common verbs are the ones that tend to be the most irregular. These are exactly the same ones, right? They're not irregular in the same way as in Spanish, but they're irregular just the same. Now, I think I already mentioned this, but the imperfeito do subjuntivo or passado do subjuntivo, it's used as in Spanish, but there's only one form. So in Spanish, I would assume that most of you use the ra form. Hablara, comiera, saliera, you probably know. You might have tortured your students like I have with the se forms in Spanish, like hablase, comiese, saliese. Well, in Portuguese, you only have the se forms. The ra forms don't exist. They exist, but they mean something else and they're archaic, right? They mean past perfect. So falasse would be the equivalent in Portuguese. Comece, saísse, ser and ir would be eu fosse, você, ele, ela, a gente fosse, nós fôssemos, vocês, eles, elas fossem. And then here's a nice sort of graffiti, right? Olhe, leia, cuide como se tudo fosse seu, right? As if everything were yours. We'll try to quickly get through the futuro do subjuntivo. This is really one of the coolest parts of Portuguese, at least to me. You may know that the Spanish future subjunctive is pretty much dead. You only find it in a few fixed expressions like sea lo que fuere, or I just saw this the other day on an episode of El Chapo, where the new Mexican president at the time, I think it's supposed to correspond to Ernesto Zedillo, said something like, si así no lo hiciere, when he was taking the oath, right? Que Dios y la patria me lo demanden. And I Googled that and I found that for lots of different Spanish speaking countries, there's some version of this. And every one, it has the future subjunctive, right? But the future subjunctive is not productive in Spanish anymore. In Portuguese, on the other hand, the future subjunctive is alive and well. And it looks a lot of times like the infinitivo pessoal that we already saw, but the future subjunctive is a finite form. So, para eu comer tudo, for me to eat everything, that's the personal infinitive. Se eu comer tudo, if I eat everything, and careful, right? Because that se is si with conditional meaning if. It's not, it also is the se pronoun in Portuguese, but here it means if. This is the future subjunctive. There are differences in a number of irregular verbs for the future subjunctive, but there are no irregular forms of the infinitivo pessoal. So they're all regular. There's nothing weird with them. So if we take a verb like saber, you would say para eu saber tudo, right? So that, or for me to know everything, versus se eu souber tudo, right? If I know everything, right? With the future subjunctive. So the conjugation here is different. And the reason the conjugation is different is because you use the third person plural past tense form, preterite form, as the base for forming the future subjunctive in Portuguese. So, so I gave you an example already with a conditional. That's where you see it a lot. So, se eu chegar na hora, te ligo. If I arrive on time, I'll call you, right? So here in Spanish, you would just have a present tense form. Si yo llego a tiempo, te llamo, right? Se chover amanhã, não vamos jogar futebol. So if it rains tomorrow, we won't play soccer. Whereas in Spanish, you'd have si llueve, right? With the present tense, which is also possible in Portuguese, but it's much more common to get the future subjunctive here. And I included here some different connective forms where you can get the future subjunctive. And here are some examples with all of those, with quando, enquanto, which is mientras, depois que, right? Después, sempre, assim que, logo que, luego que, à medida que, etc. Right? So as I said, it's constructed based on the third plural past tense form. So if you have a verb like obter, which is obtener, the third person plural past tense is obtiveram. And so like in this sentence, you would create this, you take the off and you put the mus on. So you get nós obtivermos is the first person plural future subjunctive form. Okay, so there's some practice in there. I don't think I try to trick them in this one. There are some irregulars though that the students had to fill out there. So this is it. This is the last topic. So definite article with proper names and possessives. So normative Portuguese grammar requires the definite article with names of persons, and it doesn't have a negative connotation, unlike many Spanish dialects. So you say o João or a Maria. In Brazil, this use is variable. So one of my favorite stories when I first went to Rio de Janeiro was, oh, if you go across the bridge to this other city named Niterói, they don't use the article with the proper name. And I was like, that is such a weird piece of linguistic knowledge, right? For someone to tell me. But apparently they know this. And I've talked to people from other regions who say, oh, in my region, we don't use it ever with the proper name. And then I've talked to people who say, oh yeah, we use the article with the proper name. So again, this is a variable usage in Brazil, but in Portugal, I remember watching the news in Portugal and they were going to interview some random farmer out in the middle of his field in Portugal. And they were talking about o João, o João, o João. And I was like, am I supposed to know who this person is? Like, is this supposed to be someone familiar to me? And the answer was no, it's just because they categorically use the article with the proper name. Same thing with articles with possessives, also variable in Brazil. So in Brazil, you can say either o meu carro or meu carro, a nossa casa or nossa casa, right? Either one. But in Portugal, these are much more categorical. You would say o meu carro, a nossa casa. With the article, right? So this is literally the, my car, the, our house, okay? So that's another neat difference, I think, between, between Spanish and Portuguese, but also between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese. Okay, I think that's it. So Fing, muito obrigado. Feel free to email me. We don't have a ton of time left, but maybe I can take a couple of the questions from the chat. And thank you for hanging around.
Yeah,
So
so
Mark,
if anybody has a question that they would like us to answer, there were some sort of posted throughout that I think for the most part were addressed or were just comments or observations. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to bring those up. If there aren't any questions, I have a few sort of closing remarks and reminders about upcoming events to put on your radar.
yeah, and you can also just email me with any questions. I mean, obviously there's a ton more to say about this.
Yo tengo una cortita.
Sí, dime.
You said that the most common, towards the end, the most common verbs tend to be regular. I didn't. No, you said that, no? Do you remember when you said it? Because
Yeah, they tend to be irregular.
irregular, see, yes,
Yeah,
irregular. So my question for you is like, is it does this happen in English too? No, like the most
Yes.
common verbs.
Yeah. So
You would say that.
think about be.
See, yeah.
So right, and be. So we don't say I be. We say I am, and am does not resemble be whatsoever. You are. He is, they are. I mean, it's super irregular.
Super, yeah.
But typically the explanation for this is we use those verbs so frequently that we never leave them alone. And so they never have a chance to regularize, right? We're constantly using them. We have to, right? We can't get along without to be. We can't get along without ser in Portuguese or Spanish. So they just never regularize. Other verbs that are less common regularize over time, right? So, you know, if you ask a bunch of Native American English speakers, what's the past tense of to dive, right? Is it dived or dove? And you will get people saying both, right? And because it's in flux, it's just not that frequent. Right. And there's other verbs like that where we just don't use them enough to keep them irregular. So I wanted to put those in there because it's really striking, right? How the same verbs in Spanish and Portuguese are so irregular, and they don't show any signs of becoming regular. So that was my point with that. But
the other one is like you mentioned a book by a friend of you or a person known.
Yes.
If you can give us the name.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me see.
For a gente, right?
For a gente, yeah. I don't have it here.
Or maybe later. It's okay.
Yeah, I did want to show a couple good books. They're older, but they're still really good. So the syntax of spoken Brazilian Portuguese, maybe you can write that in the chat, Mark. The syntax of spoken Brazilian Portuguese, I think is still available, even though it was published in 1969. And it's fantastic. It's a gold mine full of they're both in English. Not because I think that's necessarily the best language to publish in, but because they're easy to get a hold of, right? It's hard to get a hold of books from Brazil here, though it's getting easier. I've noticed. I've been able to buy some books that I wanted from Brazil on Amazon. And then Mario Perini, Modern Portuguese, a reference grammar. I really love it because it doesn't prescribe at all. It doesn't say this is how it should be. And if you actually read reviews of this on Amazon, you will see lots of native speakers on there saying this book is a travesty to justice because it actually talks about how people actually speak in Brazil. And of course, we all think that young people are bastardizing our native language. That's a linguistic universal, right? Like we all think younger generations are ruining our language, and it actually never happens, right? I mean, it's just normal evolution of language, but linguists would have no reason for being, right, if that didn't happen. So we thank the younger generations for bastardizing, or whatever you want to call it, the language, because we need that to justify our existence.
Any other
All right, so it's
questions?
almost 3. So Mark, you wanna give your ending?
Sorry,
spiel?
I just had a couple. I just had a couple of remarks I wanted to add.
Sure.
When you mentioned chego versus chegado, that's one I find really interesting, because I remember this one time I was talking to my dad back when I was in Brazil, and because I've lived abroad for a while now, sometimes my Portuguese is a bit faulty, even though it's my native language. And I think I said chegado, and he said, no, it's chego. And I said, no, it's chegado. Are you sure? And then we spent like a solid 2 to 5 minutes arguing on it.
That's great.
And our final conclusion was, well, we don't really know. So like, as long as the message is understood, I don't know if you're right. I don't know if I'm right, but like, it really speaks on the complexity of Portuguese.
Next time you say native speakers are the ultimate judge, right? Are the ultimate authoritative source. So if you think chego's okay, or if your dad thinks chego's okay, great, right? And like I said, that is the one that I find people most unsure about, of those ones that I put up there. And I think there are reasons for why that is. I think it's a fairly frequent verb. So people probably have just applied the pattern to it more than others, but it's not the only one. And I think we're gonna see those, alternate irregular forms. Well, maybe not in my lifetime, but in a reasonably short period of time, there'll be the normal way to say it. I see chego so often, I think that people have just accepted it now. And of course, it's not going to show up in the dictionary until later, right? It's going to take a while. Things don't show up. The dictionary is obsolete by the time it's published, right? Speakers are the ones on the cutting edge.
Oh, and another thing I wanted to add, and this is more of a curiosity than that, is that when you spoke on using nos, but using it with the third person singular as a verb, mostly as a joke, it is mostly used as a joke, but also there are areas, especially in Rio, I'm from Rio, poor area slums, where people will actually use nos with the third person singular conjugation, and it's going to be accepted, or it's going to be normal, because those areas are more unschooled, or for a plethora of reasons, but it would be common there. It wouldn't be a joke. You will see areas in Rio where that happens.
Yes, I don't think it's only in Rio. I think it's it's part of a vernacular dialect, and again, it doesn't matter that much, because they're doing two things. They're either saying nos explicitly, or they're saying a gente. And so you still know what they're saying, right? I mean, there's not going to be any ambiguity because they're using the so-called wrong conjugation. It's still going to be easy to figure out. So
yeah, and then you're going to be in areas where that usage is more normalized. If you're in a high school environment, then you're going to have some judgment or on that. But if you're in this scenario, then that's not going to happen. As with the chego-chegado dilemma, if communication is established, who am I to say that this is not appropriate?
Right. Excellent. Yeah.
So I think we'll maybe end here for the sake of time. Michelle just had to step out to go to another meeting, but she asked me if I could to plug for our Portuguese for Spanish speakers courses. So we have 2 of those, and they are both available online. So if you're interested as a Spanish speaker in learning more Portuguese, you can check those out. The person to contact would be Michelle, so I'll go ahead and put her email here in the chat in case anybody's interested. And then I just also really quickly wanted to bring your attention to 1 or 2 events and initiatives that CLAS has going on in the fall. So we have a Bolivian cinema series that we're really excited about. It's going August 12th through September 9th. There's 5 films total, and there's a link in the chat. And all of the films are within the past 10, 15 years by young Bolivian directors, usually filmed in Bolivia about Bolivia. Some of them even have indigenous languages of Bolivia included in the movies. And we're doing a hybrid modality where you can either watch them in person at the Gateway Film Center, pretty close to campus there, or you can stream them online if you'd like. And then they also have question and answer sessions with the directors.
Yeah.
That you can register for, which is a really unique chance to kind of hear about how a film was made, the inspiration behind it, and the intended message. So that's one thing we really wanted to plug for. We're still working on some of the details on the webpage, but you can see the majority of the information there. And then also for the fall, we have 3 or 4 different book box sort of, what do you call it? Part of our book box series, we'll have 3 or 4 different book boxes on different themes, and registration for that will open at the end of August. So keep an eye on our newsletter if you're subscribed. Also, you can check out our website, which again is just class.osu.edu, and details will go up there as they become available. All right, so thank you everybody for staying. Sorry we went over a little bit, but we appreciate your attendance and support, and hopefully you learned something today. And yeah, stay tuned for more events on Portuguese in the future.
Thank you. It was awesome, guys.
Muito obrigado vocês.
Thanks everybody.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigada.
Até mais.
Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.
Obrigada.